Chapter 7. The Black Cat. A modern retelling. As I write this wild yet ordinary story, I don't expect anyone to believe it, nor do I seek that belief. It would be crazy to expect it, especially when my own senses seem to deny the reality of what I'm about to share. But I'm not crazy, and I certainly am not dreaming. Tomorrow, I will die, and today, I need to unload everything on my mind. My goal is to clearly and succinctly present a series of domestic events that have terrified, tortured, and ultimately destroyed me. I won't try to explain them or make sense of them. For me, they have been nothing but horrifying, but others might find them less frightening than I perceive them to be. Perhaps one day, a more rational mind will take my story, see it more clearly, and view it as just an ordinary chain of natural events. From a young age, I was known for my gentle nature and kindness. My compassion was so obvious that it became a source of jokes among my friends. I was especially fond of animals, and my parents encouraged this by letting me keep various pets. I spent my happiest moments feeding and taking care of them. As I grew older, this love for animals remained a major joy in my life. Anyone who has had a loyal dog will understand the deep satisfaction that comes from their unconditional love. A love that can be much more fulfilling than the fragile friendship often found in humans. I married young and was happy to find that my wife shared my love for pets. She regularly added new ones to our home: birds, goldfish, a fine dog, rabbits, a small monkey, and, of course, a cat. This cat was huge and beautiful, entirely black, and incredibly smart. My wife, who had a touch of superstition, often joked about the old belief that black cats were witches in disguise. She never took it seriously, but I mention it now because it comes to mind. The cat, named Pluto, was my favorite companion. I was the only one who fed him, and he followed me everywhere around the house. He would even try to follow me outside. Our bond lasted for several years, but unfortunately, alcohol changed me for the worse. I became increasingly moody and irritable, neglecting the feelings of those around me. I began to speak disrespectfully to my wife and, eventually, even resorted to physical violence against her. Naturally, my pets felt the effects of my deteriorating temperament. I neglected and mistreated them, except for Pluto, whom I still cared for enough to avoid harming, unlike the rabbit, monkey, or even the dog, whom I mistreated when my anger flared. But as my drinking continued, even Pluto began to suffer from my ill humor. One night, after a drunken night out, I thought I noticed the cat avoiding me. In a fit of rage, I grabbed him, and in his fright, he scratched me. In that moment, fury overtook me. I was no longer myself. My humanity seemed to vanish, replaced by a more demonic will. I pulled out a penknife, grabbed the terrified cat by the throat, and brutally cut out one of its eyes. I can hardly bear to write about this horrific act. When I woke the next morning, having mostly forgotten my awful deed, I realized I felt a mix of horror and guilt, but it wasn't strong enough to shake me from my destructive lifestyle. I drowned the memory in more alcohol. In the following days, the cat slowly healed. Although the empty eye socket looked terrible, Pluto didn't seem to be in pain anymore. He moved around the house, but as one might expect, he was terrified of me. I realized that I was saddened by his fear, yet over time, that sorrow turned into irritation, and then into something much darker that leads to my ultimate downfall: perversity. This feeling of perversity is a strange trait in human nature. Who hasn't acted against better judgment simply because they can? Who hasn't felt a compulsion to do wrong simply because they know it's wrong? It was this inexplicable urge that drove me to further torment the cat. One morning, cool-headed, I slipped a noose around its neck and hung it from a tree, tearing up with every tear streaming down my face, overwhelmed with regret, and yet compelled to commit this terrible sin, knowing it would endanger my soul and place me beyond the mercy of God. That night, I was awakened by cries of fire. My bed curtains were aflame, and the entire house was ablaze. My wife, a servant, and I barely escaped the inferno, which consumed everything I owned. Afterward, I resigned myself to despair. I won't claim that the fire was a direct consequence of my terrible act, but I don't want to leave any details out to distort the truth. The following day, I visited the ruins of my home. Most of the walls had collapsed except for a single wall in the middle of the house that had withstood the flames. The plaster on this wall had mostly resisted the fire, likely because it had been freshly applied. A crowd gathered around the wall, examining one part of it with intense curiosity. I overheard people exclaiming words like strange and singular, which piqued my interest. I approached and saw an image, almost like a relief sculpture, of a large cat right on that white surface. It was shockingly accurate, and there was even a rope around the cat's neck. When I first saw this, I was filled with both wonder and fear. But then I began to think. The cat had been hanged in a garden near my house, and when the fire broke out, someone must have taken the animal down and thrown it through a window into my room to wake me. The fallen debris must have pressed the dead cat into the fresh plaster, combining with the heat, lime, and ammonia from the cat's body to create the image I saw. Though I rationalized it, my mind was deeply affected by this revelation. For months after, I couldn't shake the image of the cat from my thoughts. During this time, I even felt a sort of false regret, to the point that I began to look for another cat, similar to Pluto, to replace the one I had killed. One night, while sitting in a seedy bar, I suddenly noticed a black object resting on a large keg of rum. I couldn't believe I hadn't seen it sooner. As I approached, I realized it was a black cat, just as large as Pluto, and almost an exact match except for one detail. This cat had a large white splotch on its chest. When I touched it, the cat purred and rubbed against me, clearly thrilled with my attention. Instantly, I figured this must be the new pet I wanted. I offered to buy it from the landlord, but he claimed he had never seen it before. I took the cat home, and it immediately charmed my wife. However, I found that a growing hatred for this new cat began to build inside me. This was the opposite of what I expected. I couldn't pinpoint why, but its obvious affection for me only annoyed and disgusted me. Gradually, my feelings of disgust morphed into an all-consuming hatred. I avoided the cat, ashamed to lash out at it because of the memory of my previous cruelty. For weeks, I never hurt it, but slowly, my loathing grew so intense that I started to treat it like a plague. What intensified my hatred for the cat was the realization that it had also lost an eye, just like Pluto, but this only made my wife love it more, her empathy reminding me of the gentleness I had once possessed. Still, the new cat's affection for me seemed to grow stronger. It trailed me relentlessly, curling up at my feet or jumping into my lap, forcing itself upon me. If I tried to walk, it would trip me or cling to me, sharp claws digging into my clothes to climb up my torso. In those moments, I wanted to strike it, yet I held back, partly out of shame for my past and partly out of sheer terror of the creature. This dread wasn't exactly fear of physical harm, and yet I couldn't find a better way to describe it. I'm almost embarrassed to admit that my fear was heightened by an irrational paranoia. My wife had pointed out the distinguishing patch of white fur, the only difference between this cat and the one I had killed. Initially, it was an indistinct shape, but over time, it became increasingly defined. Now, it looked like something I dreaded to name, and this only fed my dread and disgust. It began to resemble a gallows, a symbol of horror and death, mocking me. At this point, I was utterly miserable, far worse than a mere human condition. I had a creature, one whose kind I had callously destroyed, bringing me unbearable suffering. I couldn't find relief, neither day nor night. The cat wouldn't leave me alone, and if I managed to sleep, I woke up from nightmares to find it breathing down my neck, its heavy weight, a nightmare pressing down on my heart. These tortures overwhelmed whatever goodness remained in me. Dark, evil thoughts became my only confidants. My usual irritabilities turned into utter hatred for everything, including my own wife, who bore the brunt of my anger. One day, while running an errand in the basement of our dilapidated home, the cat followed me down the stairs. Its presence frustrated me to the point of madness. In a rage, I picked up an axe and, forgetting my previous fear of the animal, I aimed to strike it down. But my wife intervened, grabbing my arm, which sent me into a more furious rage than I ever knew. I shrugged her off and struck her down, burying the axe in her skull. She died on the spot, without a sound. After committing that terrible murder, I quickly set about concealing her body. I knew I had to hide it carefully, as neighbors might notice if I tried to move it during the day or night. I considered a few options. I could cut the body into pieces and burn them, dig a grave in the cellar, or toss it in the well outside. Eventually, I settled on a seemingly clever idea. I would wall her up in the cellar, like those tales of monks from the Middle Ages who sealed their victims in. The cellar was ideal for this task. Its walls were loosely built, and the fresh plaster hadn't set properly due to the dampness. There was even a protruding section caused by a blocked chimney, which resembled the rest of the cellar. I figured I could easily remove some bricks, place her body inside, and then wall it up again without anyone noticing. I was correct in my assumptions. With a crowbar, I easily pried open the bricks, stashed her body against the wall, and then carefully restored the bricks as if they were untouched. After mixing lime, sand, and hair to create plaster that matched the old, I finished the job, feeling satisfied that no one would ever suspect anything. The wall looked just like it did before, and I cleaned up meticulously. I felt a twisted sense of triumph. With that task done, I thought about finally getting rid of the cat that had been my source of so much misery. I was resolved to kill it. I would have done it right then and there, but the creature seemingly sensed my wrath and vanished. The relief of not having that despised animal around was indescribable. It didn't come back that night, and for the first time in a long time, I slept soundly, even with the knowledge of my recent murder weighing on me. The second and third days passed, and the cat still hadn't returned. I felt free at last. I thought the monster had run away for good, and I relished my happiness. I hardly felt guilty about killing my wife anymore. Some inquiries were made, but I easily explained them away, and a search was conducted but yielded nothing. I considered my future happiness assured. Then, on the fourth day after the murder, the police unexpectedly showed up at my house and began to search the place again. Confident that my hiding spot was safe, I felt no unease. The officers asked me to join them in their investigation. They checked every corner and nook, and soon they made their way to the cellar for inspection. I remained calm. My heart beat steadily, as if I were innocent. I walked around the cellar casually, folding my arms and pacing back and forth, and the police officers seemed ready to leave. I was bursting with joy and felt the urge to boast about how I had cleared their doubts about my innocence. "Gentlemen," I said as they prepared to leave, "I'm glad to have eased your concerns. I wish you all good health and a little more courtesy. By the way, this is a very well-built house." I was so eager to speak that I hardly knew what I was saying. I'd say it's excellently constructed. "These walls, are you going, gentlemen? These walls are solid." And in a fit of bravado, I rapped heavily with my cane on the very spot where my wife's corpse lay hidden behind the wall. May God save me from evil. As soon as my knocks echoed, they were answered from within that wall. A muffled cry erupted, like the sobbing of a child, before swelling into an unmistakable scream, an unholy howl of joy and horror, as if a chorus of the damned from hell had joined together. It would be pointless to describe my thoughts. Reeling, I stumbled back against the far wall. For a moment, the officers froze on the stairs, paralyzed by terror. But then, a dozen strong arms rushed to tear down the wall. It crumbled, revealing the decayed body of my wife. Standing atop her head, with one fiery eye glaring at me and a mouth stretched wide, sat the very cat whose cunning had led me to murder, the one I had walled up inside with her. I had unwittingly sealed the monster within its gruesome tomb.